That probably means they've started recording, which means they can hear all of you. I'm just kidding. I'm Mark. This morning I'm going to be sharing a message from the New Testament, which is found in the book of Acts. I've been reading through. I don't know how many of you have been doing the reading challenge that was presented. And I don't know if maybe if some of you have already started it like you do on a regular basis. You do this Bible reading by section by section by section, or maybe you have some sort of discipline. If you're not into reading the Bible or you're not there yet, I would encourage you to do it, even if you're not a believer in Jesus. Like, it's kind of an interesting read, and at the very least, you can have questions that you can ask other people in the room and say, why would you ever think this way? Or why did this person do this? Or who is this Jesus anyway? We just encourage exploration. We think in a day and age when there are so many different ideologies that it's important for us to choose where we land. And I think that for us, those of us who would call ourselves believers in Jesus, we believe that there's a pretty solid foundation for this Jesus that we worship here on Sunday mornings. Paul thought so too, although he didn't start out that way. And I want to give you a bit of a heads up on this guy. His name was, the first encounter we have with him, his name is Saul. And I want to, some of you have heard about Saul, and he gets this massive conversion experience. Is there anybody here that has never heard about the Saul or person who was renamed Paul? No, let me do it the other way because it's embarrassing. Has anyone heard of Paul, or otherwise known as Saul? Has anybody here heard the story? Just raise your hand. There, a lot of people. Okay, maybe everybody. I don't know. The point is, his name starts in this world that he lives in. His name is Saul. He was born in a place called Tarsus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And if you think about it graphically, I don't know if you know much about, that area of the Mediterranean. I want you to think just for a second. You have Israel, and then above that you have like Lebanon, and above that you have like Syria, and then over a little bit you have Turkey, quite large, and then you have Greece. So just think about, and then there's this little island in this little cove called Cyprus. So you have Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Greece. And we're going to be talking a lot about Turkey and Greece because he was born in Turkey. He goes down to Israel to do training because he was a Hellenistic Jew. And he went down to get some training so he could figure out how is it he could live as one of these Jewish leaders. In fact, he lived this Pharisaical life. He was a well-known Pharisee. And he comes to get this training, but he's not originally from Jerusalem. He's not originally from here. He gets down and gets trained here. And then, if it's not really that surprising to us that he goes on mission, and where does he end up? He ends up back in his hometown and over here in Turkey and over here in over here in Turkey, and then ends up in Greece. He does this world tour. He ends up on this island of Cyprus a little bit, but really, he's all over the map, and he's so excited about sharing the news about this Jesus that we've been singing about and worshiping this morning. Now, the part that's most interesting, if you don't know the story of Saul, which is, some people think his name was changed to Paul, but it's actually a different name because of the different regions that he's in. Like, he might be Saul in one region, but better known as Paul in another region because that was the language of the day. It's like it's almost like you have like a Jewish name and you have a Gentile name. Okay, so he's like Saul in one area, and then over when he's doing a lot of his missionary journeys, you know that he's referred to as Paul. So that's his on-the-road name. So he has this experience. So in Acts chapter 9, this story of Acts is, you have to remember where it is in the Bible. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are firsthand accounts of this person named Jesus. And then you have this story of Acts, which is an aftermath of Jesus, after the resurrection that we took reference to this morning. And here we are experiencing what is life like after Jesus had his ministry on the earth. And one of the main characters in this story is a guy, his name is Saul. And so in Acts chapter 9, we see Saul as one of these people who just in one chapter earlier was standing there as a grand supporter and disciple of Jesus was being martyred. His name was Stephen. In fact, we think of him as the first Christian martyr. And there he was watching as this was taking place. Hard for us to believe that from chapter 8 in the book of Acts to the chapter 9 in the book of Acts, we see this incredible transformation. Why? He goes from being an opponent, a strong opponent, clearly, to the Christian movement, to the way movement, to the Jesus movement, to a point now where he is saying, wait, I now have a personal encounter with Jesus. He's on the road to Damascus. What was he on his way to do? He was on his way to bring back all those Jewish people who had turned to the way. And he said, do I have permission to go and to persecute these people? And he was given permission. He was on his way to do that very task. And he's on his way, and there he is, and he meets Jesus himself post-resurrection. Again, that should blow your mind a little bit, but we'll just move on from that. Hope you can take a look at chapter 9 and just settle there for a minute. Even if you read nothing else, just read that and just think of the encounter. This flash of light, this bright light appears. He has this personal encounter with the Lord. And even if you're trying to figure out in your mind what that movie looks like, you can't deny the fact that his life is transformed. He's blinded. He's taken to, down the road. He's taken to an area where his life was then transformed. He meets this guy named Ananias. Ananias comes and has a vision from the Lord that he is to go to this guy named Saul or Paul, and he's to go and he's to restore his sight. And you can imagine Ananias being a Jesus follower going, I'm not sure I want this task because I don't know that I trust this guy. I don't know if I want to be in his presence. And yet he was so prompted by God to go and help this man that he goes and he restores his sight. Saul not only has his sight restored, the scales fall from his eyes, which is proof of grand transformation can happen in anyone's life, even as we were talking about this morning, even if there's 10, right? Like, could it be the 10? I like 11. God is always saying, I like 11. And if he's 50, he said, I like 51. Like, he's always looking. He's looking for the next one, right? Who's ready? Who's ready? And Saul was ready. And he's baptized. And disciples of Jesus were even skeptical at that moment. Even the disciples of Jesus, they're like, no way this guy has transformed like that. There's no way that this guy could be coming for us full force and then do a 180. There's no way in his heart. And yet that's exactly what happened. Ananias comes, he heals him, and he is on the road to changing the world. He meets this guy named Barnabas, and Barnabas is the guy that vouched for Saul and said to the disciples, no, this guy's legit. This guy's, he's preaching the gospel, true thing. I've seen him firsthand. And if you don't believe him, believe me, because we have a relationship. And they did, and they came to understand that Saul really was the real deal. And he convinces the disciples, and the church grew in Judea and Samaria and all of Galilee. Do you get what I'm saying? So right down in Israel, up here in Syria, and all the way over in Turkey and Greece. Like, it's starting to grow. That's what's happening. And so he's on his way. And Saul and Barnabas, in Acts chapter 13, after a little divot with a story about Peter, Saul and Barnabas set apart themselves for the missionary work. In fact, they were set apart by God to do this missionary work. They go to Cyprus, so they go to this island, and they meet this Jewish sorcerer who opposes the gospel. And by the power of the Spirit, they come, and this sorcerer was opposed in a very proper way. They go to Pisidian Antioch up in Turkey. They go to the synagogue, which is very customary for them. When they go to an area, they go to the synagogue to make the difference because they're Jewish leaders. And so a whole city is gathering by the next Sunday. So if one Sunday a few people heard about it, by the next Sunday the whole place was packed. Like, there wasn't a person in the city who didn't want to hear the story from Paul. And they were there, and they heard. And guess what happens? Some Jewish leaders were jealous, and they create an uprising, and they expel Saul and Barnabas out of the place. But you know what happens? In their heart, I love how this chapter ends, they're filled with joy. They're filled with joy to be suffering for the sake of the gospel. Just thrilled. So they keep going on their way. They go to another part of Turkey. They go to Iconium. They're in the synagogue. There are a great number of believers, but they heard of plans of people coming to harm them. So Barnabas and Saul, they fly off to Lystra and Derbe, which is very close to his hometown of Tarsus. He heals a lame man. He convinces people there that he is from God, but actually he tries, but he really struggles because they actually think when he does this healing of a lame man, that they actually think that he and Barnabas are gods. They literally give them the Greek names of Zeus and Hermes. Like, you guys are out of this world, and we are going to worship you. And can you imagine the irony of all this? He's going, no. At one point, he was probably, as a Pharisaical leader, he was saying, I want all the attention on me. And now he's trying to get all the attention off of him. Who would have ever thought that Saul would have been thought of as a Greek god? And yet here he was trying to convince people of this. Human beings trying to convince that he was not a Greek god. And because they wouldn't believe him, and he opposed them so strongly, they start throwing stones at him. They drag him out of the city, and they force him to move on. Because enemies from another city that they already visited came in and infiltrated this talk and said, no, let's be opposed to them. There's always going to be opposition to the good news, always. But he knew this. He said, listen, I'll do whatever. In fact, earlier in the scripture, God said, he said, you know what? Saul's going to have to figure out how much he's going to have to suffer for the sake of the gospel. And I think some of us have to start thinking about, how much do I have to suffer for the sake of the gospel? Am I willing to lay it down for the sake of the gospel? What am I willing to sacrifice for the sake of the gospel? You go through this story, he's laying it all down. He's almost killed at this moment, it seemed. He's stoned and dragged out of the city. And then by his own actions, disciples are strengthened in that area. Isn't it interesting that with that resistance, just like muscle building, with the resistance, the church grew. So they end up back after all of this, this opposition, but also probably more importantly, the good news being shared in all of these areas, especially in Turkey. They head back to Jerusalem. And they start rejoicing in Syria and Jerusalem, in Israel, and they start telling the story. Acts 15, they stand in the place, and he's realizing he is called to share the good news with people who haven't heard it before. So in Jerusalem, you have all these people who have heard they've heard about God, they have the Torah, they have all these things in their background that point them toward the good news of the Messiah, but they just didn't receive Jesus as that Messiah yet. And he's trying to implore them with this idea, but he says, you know what? If you're going to reject this, I have a place where I can go. In fact, I, by nature, am a Galilean. I'm a Roman citizen. I'm a Roman citizen by birth. Because they were over us. The Syrians, the area of Turkey, they were overseen by the Roman Empire, and so they were Roman citizens. And he said, I'll be a Gentile. I'll go preach to them. He was instructed by God to go preach to them. He was standing there, though, in Jerusalem, and he's there disputing the believing Pharisees who wanted to say that these Gentiles, if a Gentile wants to believe, that's okay. Someone who's not a Gentile is just someone who's not a Jew. And so Gentile was someone who was standing there in the face of the Jews and saying, yes, I would like to receive this good news from you, Saul or Paul. But they were saying, the Jews were saying, oh, that's fine, but they just have to be circumcised, and they have to follow all of the laws that we follow. And Paul was saying, I don't think that's the case. In fact, the gospel that Jesus has asked me to preach is the one of grace, the one where I come to you and I haven't earned a thing. How could I say that? I could say that, Saul was saying, because I knew all of the scriptures. I lived perfectly. I knew the law. I lived it out. I lived it strong. In fact, I was passionate, so much so that I was standing what I thought to be in a right opposition to those who stood in a different direction. I thought I was standing in the right way. But he said, I learned that I owe my heart to a God of grace, who took the scales off my eyes, who gave me an experience where I could meet Jesus face to face. I had the scales taken off my eyes, and he gave me a mission to go and share this good news. And I think we're supposed to allow ourselves to be instructive to these people, but I don't think that we have to impose our culture on them. We need to meet them where they're at. And so it was that they made this compromise, I guess, if you want to call it that, and they went and they gave this message to the Gentiles in Antioch, just a little bit north, and they were pleased and thrilled, and off went Paul on his second mission. Now, in the second mission, Barnabas and Paul, they got into a bit of a dispute, and the reason was, when they were on their first mission, there was this guy, his name was John, interestingly also known as Mark, and they had a dispute over Mark. And so Mark left them at one point during that first mission, and so they're having this bit of debate. Barnabas didn't want to go with this guy, or Saul didn't want to go with this guy, or Paul, but Barnabas did. So Barnabas went off with Mark, but Paul now picked up a guy, his name was Silas, and they went on the second missionary journey. So they're heading back through Turkey and then into Greece, okay? So just get this idea of this little ramp that they're doing. And so in Lystra, they meet with Timothy. If you heard his name before, they meet up with Timothy in Acts chapter 16. And I'm giving you all this preamble because we're really focusing in on 17. And then they go to Greece for the first time. They get a vision. They thought they were supposed to continue in one direction, maybe even still in Greece. But God prompts their heart and says, no, you need to go to Greece. You need to go to Greece. I have a gospel-centered mission for you in Greece. And he does. And he goes. And he goes to this place called Macedonia. And that's where they met Lydia. Her whole family gets baptized. And then he does this miracle, like he casts out a demon out of a spirit out of a fortune teller, a girl, a young woman perhaps, who was working for other people in the community and telling fortunes for fortune. And so when they cast out this spirit, the owners were outraged that their income was gone, and lies and uprising began. And all of a sudden, Paul and Silas were dragged into prison. In that prison, they prayed at midnight, and they sang at midnight, and all of a sudden there was this incredible violent earthquake, and the doors to the jail or prison became opened. The jailer was scared and amazed that after he had called out, because his responsibility was to keep them there and make sure that they didn't go anywhere. He thought he had lost them and was going to take his own life because that was going to be his fate anyway, and he'd rather take it himself than allow someone else to do it more dubiously. Paul and Silas call out, we're still here. We're not going anywhere. And through their obedience, through their calmness in that moment of earthquake, the jailer and his family understood that they were worshiping a God worthy of belief. His whole household was saved. They were baptized. And then they moved on to a place called Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, they go to a synagogue, which is normal. Some believe, some follow. There's an uprising. They move on. They go to Berea. There's a synagogue. Many believed. Others became insightful. Silas and Timothy stay there. And this is where the story transitions to Athens. So this is the believers sent Paul to Athens for his own sake. There's been a lot of uprising, a lot of opposition. All of this was happening. And now he's in Athens by himself. I want you to picture a time when you were in a new place by yourself. Maybe you've never experienced that. I don't know. Maybe you can't remember experiencing that. But if not, just imagine it. You're in a new city, unfamiliar, you've never been to before, and you're standing there by yourself. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to observe. You're going to look. You're going to see what is around you. You're going to listen to the language. You're going to smell the smells of that place. You're going to hear the conversations. You're going to try to do anything you can to get yourself familiar with that which is around you. And that's exactly what Paul did at this point. He's there in this new place. And we're going to take it up by reading. If you have a Bible, we're going to look at Acts chapter 16. I think it's starting maybe verse 16. I'll look. Yep. And by some mastery that often happens, the scriptures just might be behind me. I don't know. I didn't ask for them, but they probably could be. Acts 17, verse 16. And I'm reading from the NIV. I won't put any pressure on you there. But while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, so he's waiting for Silas and Timothy, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of, anyone know that word? Idols. Do I not have, it's Acts chapter 17. Yeah, there you go. The city was full of idols. So this was a pagan city. It was a place filled with idolatry. They were putting up idols in lots of different ways. And maybe you've been to a foreign city or country where you've seen a lot of idols in places that were unfamiliar to you, but very physically apparent. So there it was. He was in Athens, and that's exactly what the case was. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. So two very important places that he went. He went to the synagogue, where he had the spiritual people who had some spiritual background. And we meet those people every day. Like, we have people who are very in tune with their spiritual self, but we have varying opinions about what that spiritual self might look like. And then he went into the marketplace, a very common place where the social life was happening. Everyone was just walking in no particular interest, probably for the most part, in a specific religion. They just were there. It wasn't like a specific place, like a synagogue. Now, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. So Epicureans and Stoic, I don't know if anyone's ever ordered from Epicure. You know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about? Like the seasonings or whatever? Epicure, it's a word that really means pleasure. Or sometimes it's even like extravagance. It's something where the Epicureans were people who just loved pleasure. And now you might think immediately of certain pleasures in your life, but this is just calmness. Places that brought us pleasure, which meant life was good. It was very basic. Like, life is good. Now, it could be different extremes of that. We also have, guilty pleasures like ice cream or whatever it is, chips of some kind. But they're guilty pleasures that we have. But this is just pleasure. They just want life to be calm. And so you met the Epicureans, and they were like these pleasure seekers, but often referred to as deists. So they would say that there is a God, but he's distant. He started things in motion, but he really doesn't have anything to do with us day to day. And then you have the Stoics that it talks about. The Stoics are more pantheistic. So they would say that there are multiple gods that might deal with different things in our life, but really, for the most part, we're the ones that have to control our own destiny. With the help of these gods, we're going to make decisions, and we often see this like secular humanists say, okay, we have to make some decisions about the world, how we're going to treat one another in the midst of the chaos of the world. Let's make it good, because we think good wins over evil. So you have these philosophers, Stoic philosophers, and these Epicureans, some that are just trying to make it pleasing and just everything is woo, and then other people who are very, judgmental, and they're trying to think things through. They're very courageous, and they're trying to determine what the next step is. So you have these different people. Point is, whether you ever remember what an Epicurean or a Stoic philosopher is, the point is that they had different views, and they're very curious people, and they see the world differently. And so he began to debate with Paul. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? The word babbler is like, think of a chicken or a bird that picks up a seed and then spits it out. Picks up a seed and spits it out. So this is someone that they think, Paul, are you just someone that's picked up this little bit from this religion and spit it out on us, and then picked it up from this little religion and spit it out on us like a babbler? Like we're just spitting out, you're just spitting stuff at us like a babbler. Others remarked he seemed to be advocating foreign gods when he's talking about Jesus, of course. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection, which both of those things would be foreign to them. The Jesus and the resurrection, which to many of us in this room, those things wouldn't be foreign at all. And yet you wouldn't even think you'd have to explain those things to a lot of people. Yet today in our culture, and more every day as days go by, we have to explain more about who Jesus is and what the resurrection is, which is why we do things like communion. So then they took him and they brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. Now the Areopagus was up on the Acropolis. Acropolis just meaning the top of the city. And the Areopagus was this high council of, like the highest council court that you could have. They were the ones that thought through they loved new philosophies, they loved to hear new things, but they ultimately were the ones who made the decisions. And so here he was, being invited, just getting to Athens, and now being invited to the cream of the Acropolis. You like that? Okay. So there it was, up on the top, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? So, very clear, it's a new teaching. It's a new teaching. He is in an area of Athens. City is full of idols. He's meeting people in the synagogue. He's meeting people in the marketplace. He's now meeting people in the Areopagus at the top of the Acropolis, where they are having conversations about the most philosophical of dreams. He's meeting with the spiritual, he's meeting with the skeptics, and he's meeting with the scholarly here in this place that he has never been. And we're now going to see what his response is. May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. What's his response? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. They loved to learn. How many of you know someone that just loves to learn? Maybe you're that person who loves to learn. These people love to learn. So they're asking these questions. All the Athenians and all the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Wouldn't that be interesting if that was our entire life? Paul then stood up in front of the meeting of the Areopagus, and he said, people of Athens. So an exclamation mark here seems he wasn't really whispering. He was emphatic. He was strong, courageous, not rude. People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. So he sees what's around him. He's trying to do anything he can to connect with the people who are there. He wants to be able to express to them his heart, but he knows that he has to take certain steps before his heart will ever be heard. And so he says, people of Athens, I see that you're very religious. I looked carefully at your objects of worship. Now imagine for a second what it is that they were worshiping. They were objects of worship to things like prosperity and wisdom and improvement in politics and victories and beauty and sexuality and fertility and power. And they wanted to make sure that they were worshiping all of these different types of God. This would be the pantheistic view, several or many gods. And he says, but this is the important part. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Why would they ever have an inscription to an unknown God? Just in case they missed one. Because they said that if there's any area over our lives that we're not praying for or to a God about, and we let that little crack allow that bolt of lightning to come down and strike us, we don't want that ever to happen. So we need to put this overarching altar to an unknown God, which is his launching pad for the conversation. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. You love to learn. I want to teach you something today. That's what he's saying. You say you have an unknown God. I want to tell you who this unknown God is. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you now. The God who made the world. He starts with God. This is something they can conceive. They haven't yet gotten to the place of Jesus, okay? But yet, in a very short moment, he's going to be getting to Jesus. But as we sung this morning, songs that started with God and made their way to Jesus, here's exactly what happens in this moment. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. At that moment, in one sentence, he's gotten their attention. He's having them think about, what is it that we've been believing all along? What are the idols that we've been creating for? What are the things in our lives that we've been holding on to tightly, worshiping and giving our time and attention, even money to? What is it that we've been doing all along? He captures that and challenges that in one sentence. And maybe for us, we would stop, and if we were hearing him today, we would say, what is it that has captured our heart and become an idol in our life? I always have to do that as a leader, not because it's not something that I don't have to think about. I do. There are idols in my life, and no doubt there are in yours. But what has captured our hearts so much that it has distracted us from the one God who is over all, the unknown God that we've forgotten or misled ourselves to believe that there's another who can attest to meeting those needs that we have in our lives. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in the temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Their mind is racing. From one man, he made all the nations, that they would inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. He's now challenging their belief and their interest in knowing how the world began. He's saying from one man. He's pointing to creation. He's saying that there is one origin to this world that we live in. God created that one man, and from that man came you and me. He marked out the appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Isn't there a moment of hope in that statement? He's not far from any one of us. He's not even far from you. All these idols that are in your presence and now in mine. Can we give consideration to this one that you have, to an unknown God? For in him we live and move and have our being. He is now pressing the deists. He's now pressing the pantheists. He's now saying there is one God who can satisfy everything in your life. In him we live and we move and we have our being. As some of your own poets have said, notice now he's turning it back on them with things that they understand and that they have embraced. They're taking one of their own poets. We are his offspring. He's using a quote to try and capture their hearts as to what he is trying to say, using the very context that he's in. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human hands or design or skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Now the challenge is coming. And now the introduction of Jesus is coming as well. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. There it is. He goes very quickly in one conversation to identifying something they have in common, to identifying a need, to identifying a solution, and now demanding a response. When they heard this about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Some of them just sneered. They said, this is ridiculous, as you can imagine. But here's the news. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council, and some of the people became followers of Paul, and they believed. And among them was Dionysius, who was a member of the Areopagus, the highest council, the highest court, the ones who thought and had philosophy about all of these world religions. And also a woman named Damaris and a number of others. He connects with them. He loves them. And he loves them enough to speak their language, to allow them to hear truth, to express an interest in their good questions. You know, with Jesus, when it comes to Jews and God-fearers, there would be no need to discuss the supremacy of God or the futility of idolatry. But this context needed this conversation. He uses references for the centrality of Christ. He uses references for the resurrection. He uses references for repentance, references for judgment. In other words, he talks about Jesus, he talks about God, he talks about miracles, he talks about what is right and what is wrong, he talks about the afterlife, and where do you find your hope? That's probably more common to the way we speak those languages today. It's the very same thing that God calls us to in our culture. I read a quote, it said, we must know where people are in their understanding of their biblical worldview. In other words, what their worldview is. Once the foundational truths have been established, we can then proceed to present the heart of the gospel, which is God's work in and through Jesus Christ. What he was trying to do is he was trying to identify through his observation of the idols that were marked, what is the felt need in the community? The idols represented the felt needs. They wouldn't be praying for anything if it wasn't a felt need. And so in our culture, we could sit here and identify, it'd be a great exercise if we had time to do this corporately. Well, no, I'll do it. So what are some felt needs in our culture? Tell me anything that you say, if we were praying for something, if there was an idol and we thought there was a God who could make a response to it, what would we pray for? What is the felt need that we're longing for in our lives? No needs. I'm just kidding. Comfort. We're going to pray to a God for comfort. No more war. God of peace. Food, yeah, that's right. So we're going to pray to the God of the fields and the harvest, right? No doubt there was an idol for that. Right, so whether it be to have family or to embrace family, the God of the mothers and fathers and children and fertility and all this, like family. Forgiveness. So whatever you think that is, and that's a great by itself question to ponder is what do I think about sin and what do I need forgiven for? But whatever I need forgiven for, right? Healing. So physical healing, right? So we want to have a God that's going to come and heal us when we are sick. These are very common, right? And so when we have like things like love and purpose and truth and peace and relationship and joy and satisfaction and understanding of the afterlife. Maybe when it comes to sin, how many, what do I have to do to earn your favor, God? What effort or status or good works must I do? We want freedom and we want a clear conscience. We want health and wellness. We have all of these things that we are desiring for God to meet our needs for. But if you're a secular humanist or you're an atheist or you're a polytheist or if you're of a religion that says, I am God or I can become God, or maybe you believe like deism is that God is just distant and we're on our own. We all have different answers to those questions. But at some point, when Jesus enters the conversation, through an important conversation about God, we start having the real questions being answered and thought about. Ultimately, what this is about is Paul understands the context that he's in. He understands the context. He understands the demographics. Who's here? Age, race, what language do you speak? What's your income? What's your gender? He understands. He's looking around. He can see it all. He can see what is all around him. But then he understands the culture. What do I believe about A, B, C, D, and E? He understands the context. He's standing right in it. He can't do a lot. Like we can't do a lot to change the context that we're in. We live in the Annapolis Valley. There's not a lot that we can do to change our context. But then we have an understanding about the culture. What do people see themselves to be? What are their views on religion and politics and TV and music and food and sports and money and work ethic and all these things? Like, what are these things? He's trying to grasp this in a very short period of time. So he's trying to understand the context. He's trying to understand the culture so that he can then communicate well. That there be an understanding of culture and context so that he could share the gospel appropriately. We've said for years, our desire is to see the people and the culture, the context and the culture of the Annapolis Valley transformed by our communication of the gospel. That's what we've said. And for us, we want to learn something from Paul today. That as he enters this new region, he thinks, much like we've heard from a quote that I'm going to share from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., said the Christian is called upon not to be like a thermometer conforming to the temperature of society, but he must be like a thermostat serving to transform the temperature of his society. And that's what he was doing. He wasn't just there to find out what the temperature was. He was there to be a thermostat to change the temperature. That's why every one of us who have received this good news of Jesus, We're not here just to identify. It's not enough just to identify what's the temperature. It's for us to go and change the temperature. And not in ways that are condescending or rude. It's through relationship. It's through understanding what is it that you believe. And let me tell you my story. No doubt Paul told his story. Who could tell a story like Paul? Who could very much waver from the idea of my life has been changed? How can I not tell this story? So you ask yourself, what are the questions that people around me are asking? What are the unknown gods that people are considering? And what answer does Jesus offer to those questions? See, in our culture, we have to ask ourselves, what cultural idols provoke us? What do people believe? What are our grounds for agreement? And how can we respectfully express our disagreement? How can we point people to God and offer answers through Christ's life, death, and resurrection? Ultimately, who do you say God is? And who do you say Jesus is? Some believed, others didn't. But the culture was changed. Tim Keller wrote this. He said, to contextualize with balance and successfully reach people in a culture, we must both enter the culture sympathetically and respectfully. And I think that's our responsibility as believers. To enter the world we're in with lots of chaos, with lots of differing opinions. You go to the news and you can have lots of differing opinions about the war that's happening overseas. You have lots of opinions about whether it comes to certain social issues, homelessness, what we should be doing with politics, how does that relate to religion? I mean, lots of things in the world. But ultimately, it's not just enough to be understanding what the temperature is. It's about understanding what we can do to change the temperature. Today, I was trying to think, what is it, God, why did you have me share this? Because I felt very strongly that I was supposed to share Acts 17 today. Two things. One is I hope that you'll be considering the own questions of unknown gods and how we can share our own thoughts and have good conversations in our culture. But probably even more important to that is something that you may not expect. And it's that a week ago I couldn't have preached this. And you know how I can preach it today? Because I studied it. There's so much here that I could not have shared with you last week. As every day goes by and my memory gets shorter and shorter, I wish I could say that I understand it like I used to be able to remember in my 20s. I can't. But boy, is it refreshing when you get back into it and realize just how good the gospel is. And just how good it is to hear people who have life-changing stories that can impact my life and then impress upon me to share it with others. So maybe that's even the more important thing I'm going to share with you today. Read in the Word. It's good. Not only read it and figure out what the temperature is, engage it and see what the temperature changes in you. I hope you were challenged today in some way. I hope you're encouraged in some way. And if you ever have questions, I'd love to talk to you. Let's just pray and thank God for what he's teaching us this morning. Spirit, I just thank you for impressing on us this morning whatever it is you've had for us. No doubt you've spoken to us all differently.